Joey's parents seemed tense during the drive to his great-grandmother's house, more tense than he had ever seen them. His mom was gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, and his dad kept glancing over at Joey, his face a mix of worry and guilt. They told him that Grandma Betty was family, and with work keeping them busy all summer, she was the best option for him to spend a few weeks away. Joey knew this wasn't exactly a vacation for him, but he didn't realize just how strange the summer would become. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Joey got his first real look at Grandma Betty's farmhouse. It was tall and narrow, covered in peeling white paint and half hidden by creeping ivy that twisted up its sides like gnarled hands. The windows were dark, each one a pair of black, hollow eyes watching him. For a second, Joey thought he saw movement behind one of the curtains, but when he looked again, the window was empty. When they finally parked, Joey's mom turned to him, her eyes looking more tired than he'd ever seen. "Be good for Grandma Betty, okay?" she said softly, not quite meeting his gaze. Joey tried to ask her why they'd never come to visit Grandma Betty before, but she just gave him a sad smile, a look that almost seemed like an apology. "Joey," she whispered, as his dad unloaded the bags from the trunk. "Just listen to her, okay? Do what she asks. And don't go wandering in the woods alone." Before he could ask what she meant, his parents were climbing back into the car, waving as they drove off down the long, winding driveway, leaving him alone in the fading sunlight. Grandma Betty stood on the porch, her bony fingers clutching the railing as she watched him with a strange intensity. Her thin frame was draped in a faded, floral dress, and her gray hair fell loose around her shoulders, giving her a wild, almost ghostly appearance. Joey felt a chill crawl down his spine as he walked up to her, her pale blue eyes never leaving his. "Come inside, Joey," she said, her voice creaky but steady. Her eyes held a strange glint, something that made Joey want to look away, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "There's plenty of time to get settled before dinner." He followed her inside, his footsteps echoing in the narrow, dark hallway. The house was filled with the smell of old wood, dust, and something sharp and metallic, like pennies left in the sun. Heavy, dark curtains covered the windows, casting the rooms in dim, murky light that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The walls were lined with photographs, each one a faded black and white portrait of solemn, unsmiling faces. Men, women, children. All of them stared out of their frames with blank, expressionless eyes, as though they'd been forced to hold still for too long. Joey shivered as he walked past them, feeling as if he were being watched. "Family," Grandma Betty said as she noticed his gaze lingering on the photos. "They're always with us, even when they're gone." Joey forced a polite smile, but the photographs made him uneasy. There was something odd about them, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Dinner will be ready soon," Grandma Betty said, leading him into the kitchen. "Make yourself at home." The kitchen was small and cluttered, with shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and roots, and an old stove that looked like it hadn't been replaced since the house was built. A pot simmered on the stove, filling the air with a rich, earthy smell that made Joey's stomach rumble, even as his unease grew. As he set his backpack down, he noticed a large, faded cookbook on the kitchen table. It looked ancient, its cover worn and frayed, with strange symbols scrawled along the spine. Joey reached out to touch it, but Grandma Betty's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Not yet," she said, her voice a whisper. "That's family business." Joey nodded, pulling his hand back, the chill returning. He wasn't sure what she meant by family business, but he knew enough not to ask. Dinner was a strange affair. Grandma Betty ladled a thick, dark stew into a bowl and set it in front of him, watching intently as he took his first bite. The stew was rich and salty, the meat tough and chewy, with a metallic tang that made his mouth water and his stomach twist. He never tasted anything quite like it. "Good, isn't it?" Grandma Betty asked, her eyes gleaming. Joey forced himself to nod, swallowing hard. "Yeah, it's different." She smiled, a slow, almost predatory smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "It's an old family recipe," she said, her voice soft. "In this family, we don't waste anything." He didn't ask what she meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Over the next few days, Joey fell into an uneasy routine. Each morning, Grandma Betty would send him out into the woods with a basket and an old, leather-bound book filled with sketches of herbs and mushrooms. The plants in the book were strange. Some looked like normal forest plants, but others had twisted shapes, almost alien, and colors that seemed to shift when he looked at them too closely. "Pick only what's in the book," she told him sternly. "The woods can be unforgiving to those who don't follow the rules." Joey nodded, clutching the book tightly as he ventured into the forest. The trees were tall and dense, their twisted branches blocking out most of the sunlight, casting long shadows across the ground. The forest was silent, eerily so, as if even the animals knew to stay hidden. Sometimes, Joey thought he heard whispers, faint voices that drifted through the trees like the wind, but whenever he turned, there was nothing there. He spent hours searching for the plants in the book, carefully picking the herbs and mushrooms and placing them in the basket. Some of the plants were easy to find, but others seemed to appear only when he wasn't looking, as if the forest itself were playing tricks on him. Each evening, he would bring the basket back to Grandma Betty, who would inspect his findings with a critical eye. She would then use them in her cooking, mixing them into the stews and pies she served for dinner. The meals were rich and filling, but Joey couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong about them. The meat was always tough and chewy, with a flavor that he couldn't quite place, and the metallic tang lingered on his tongue long after he'd finished eating. One evening, after a particularly unsettling dinner, Joey lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, but it was a heavy, oppressive silence, as if the walls were holding their breath. He was just beginning to drift off when he heard it, the soft, shuffling footsteps moving down the hallway outside his room. His heart pounded as he sat up, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside his door. He held his breath, expecting the door to creak open, but the footsteps moved on, heading down the stairs toward the basement. Curiosity got the better of him, and he slipped out of bed, creeping to the door. He peered down the hallway, his heart racing as he watched Grandma Betty descend the stairs, a small, flickering candle in her hand. She moved slowly, her head bent, her lips moving as if she were whispering to someone. He followed her down the stairs, careful to stay out of sight. She reached the basement door and opened it, stepping inside. Joey hesitated, but something compelled him to follow, his curiosity outweighing his fear. The basement was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and something else, something rotting. Grandma Betty moved to the far end of the room, where a trapdoor lay hidden beneath a pile of old, rotting crates. She lifted the trapdoor, revealing a dark, narrow staircase that led even deeper underground. Joey watched in horror as she descended the stairs, disappearing into the darkness below. He wanted to turn back, to run, but his feet moved of their own accord, carrying him down the stairs after her. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, cramped room lined with shelves filled with jars and bottles. Strange plants and herbs floated in murky liquid, their shapes twisted and unnatural. And in the corner of the room was a figure, thin and gaunt, his skin pale and sickly. "Help me," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes were wide, filled with terror as he looked up at Joey. "Please, she's going to come back." Joey's stomach twisted, his mind reeling as he took in the man's words. He wanted to help, to do something, but at that moment, he heard the creak of footsteps on the stairs. He turned, his heart pounding, and saw Grandma Betty standing in the doorway, her eyes cold and unblinking. "What are you doing down here, Joey?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. I got lost," he stammered, backing away from her. Her gaze was hard, her expression unreadable as she stepped forward, her hand reaching out to grab his shoulder. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers digging into his skin like claws. "Come now, Joey," she said, her voice soft but filled with menace. "It's time for bed." From that night on, Joey was never the same. The house felt darker, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. He could feel Grandma Betty's eyes on him constantly, watching, waiting, and every night, he heard the footsteps moving through the hallway, down the stairs, and into the basement. Joey knew what was down in that basement. He had seen it with his own eyes, the horrors hidden beneath the trapdoor. But what he didn't know was why. Why his great-grandmother would keep a man chained up down there, starving, his eyes sunken and hollow, his voice reduced to desperate whispers begging for help. Each night, when he heard the familiar creak of her footsteps heading downstairs, he felt a cold dread gnawing at him. But now, he was starting to piece together the truth, bit by bit, from the little things he observed and the things he was afraid to question. Each night, after dinner, Grandma Betty would sit in her chair by the fire, knitting in silence, her eyes fixed on the flames with a distant, almost vacant stare. But when she glanced over at Joey, her eyes would light up with a strange gleam. It was as if she was seeing through him, as if she was looking at something deep inside him, something only she understood. He noticed that she seemed to watch him more closely with each passing day, her gaze lingering a little longer, her smile growing a little wider. And as he lay in bed at night, he began to understand the way her voice had trembled slightly when she'd said, "It's in your blood." One night, Joey finally worked up the courage to follow her down to the basement again. He waited until she was well ahead, the glow of her candle disappearing down the stairs. When he reached the bottom, he crouched behind a stack of old crates, watching from the shadows as she moved toward the trapdoor. Grandma Betty set down her candle and lifted the trapdoor with a strange reverence, almost as if she were handling something sacred. She descended the narrow steps, her figure vanishing into the darkness below. Joey hesitated, but something compelled him forward, and he crept to the edge of the trapdoor, peering down into the pit. There, in the dim light of the candle, he saw the man, huddled, barely alive, his face a pale mask of terror. Grandma Betty stood over him, her expression cold, detached, as if he were nothing more than a piece of meat to be inspected. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sharp knife, her fingers caressing the blade as she watched him with a calculating gaze. The man whimpered, his body shaking, but he didn't have the strength to fight. He only looked up at her, his eyes filled with a silent plea for mercy. But there was no mercy in Grandma Betty's eyes. She leaned down, her face inches from his, her voice a low, menacing whisper. "You're part of something bigger now," she murmured, a twisted smile spreading across her face. "In this family, we don't waste anything." Then, with a swift, practiced motion, she cut into his arm, just deep enough to draw blood. She held out a small glass jar, catching the crimson liquid as it dripped from his wound. The man cried out, his voice a broken, hoarse whisper, but Grandma Betty only shushed him, her tone almost tender. "Shh," she whispered, brushing his hair back with a motherly gesture that felt grotesque in its gentleness. "This is for the family, for our bloodline. You should be honored." She continued to collect his blood in silence, her movements methodical, her face devoid of any emotion. When she finished, she placed the jar carefully on a nearby shelf, alongside dozens of others, each one filled with a thick, dark liquid, labeled with names that Joey didn't recognize. Names that seemed to stretch back through generations, each one marking another victim. Joey watched, horrified, as Grandma Betty turned and made her way back up the stairs, leaving the man huddled in the corner, his life slowly draining away. She closed the trapdoor with a quiet, final thud, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were sealing something sacred. The next morning, Joey found himself sitting across from her at the breakfast table, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. He couldn't shake the image of those jars, each one a testament to the dark legacy his family carried. And he couldn't ignore the way Grandma Betty watched him with that same calculating gaze, as if she were weighing his worth, deciding when it would be his turn to join the others in the basement. Over the next few days, her behavior grew stranger, more intense. She would watch him as he ate, her eyes fixed on him with a hunger that went beyond mere curiosity. She began to speak to him in cryptic phrases, telling him about the strength that ran through their blood, the power that came from their lineage. She told him that their family was special, that they had been given a gift that others could never understand. One evening, as they sat by the fire, She leaned toward him, her voice low and filled with a twisted kind of reverence. "Do you know why I chose you, Joey?" she asked, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. Joey shook his head, his throat dry. "Because you're special," she whispered, her fingers grazing his cheek. "You have something in you, something that connects you to the family's past, to the family's hunger." She took his hand, her grip cold and firm, and held it tightly. "You'll understand soon enough," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "And when the time comes, you'll embrace it, just like they all did." Each night after that, Joey lay in bed, haunted by her words, by the images of the man in the basement, by the names written on those jars. He began to understand the horrible truth that his great-grandmother saw him not as her grandson, but as the next link in a chain of horror that stretched back generations. And he knew, deep down, that he couldn't escape it. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard the familiar creak of footsteps moving down the hallway. But this time, he didn't wait for her to pass. He slipped out of bed, creeping down the stairs after her, his heart pounding in his chest. He followed her into the kitchen, where she was preparing another one of her strange, dark stews. He watched from the shadows as she added herbs and roots, stirring the pot with a slow, rhythmic motion. Then, to his horror, he saw her reach for one of the jars on the shelf, the jar with the man's name scrawled on it. She opened the jar, pouring a thick, dark liquid into the stew, her movements careful and deliberate. The smell filled the room, rich and metallic, making Joey's stomach turn. He watched, horrified, as she ladled the stew into a bowl, her face serene, almost peaceful. She sat at the table, taking a slow, deliberate sip, her eyes drifting to the empty chair across from her. "Soon, Joey," she murmured to herself, her voice barely a whisper. "Soon, you'll be ready." Joey couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, he confronted her, his voice shaking as he demanded to know the truth. She looked at him with a sad smile, as if she had been expecting this moment. "Joey," she said softly, her voice filled with a strange tenderness. "Our family is different. We have a gift that has been passed down through generations. It's in our blood, a hunger that can never be satisfied, but we've learned to live with it, to embrace it." She took his hand, her fingers cold and bony. "One day you'll understand. You'll feel it too. The hunger, the need. And when that day comes, you'll join me, just like all the others." Joey pulled his hand away, his heart pounding. He didn't want to believe her, but deep down, he knew she was telling the truth. He could feel it, the hunger she spoke of, a faint, nagging itch at the back of his mind, a dark whisper that grew louder with each passing day. As the days turned into weeks, Joey's sense of dread only grew. He knew that his time was running out, that Grandma Betty was waiting for something, some signal, some sign that he was ready. And he knew that when that day came, he would be powerless to resist. One night, as he lay in bed, he felt a strange sensation wash over him, a warmth, a tingling that spread through his veins like fire. He sat up, his heart pounding, as the hunger surged within him, stronger than ever before. He stumbled out of bed, his vision blurry, his mind clouded with a dark, insatiable need. He found himself wandering down the stairs, drawn by a force he couldn't understand, couldn't control. In the kitchen, Grandma Betty was waiting for him, her face calm, serene. She held out her hand, and he took it, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over him. "It's time, Joey," she whispered, her voice filled with a twisted kind of love. "You're ready." He followed her down to the basement, his mind numb, his body moving on its own. She opened the trapdoor, leading him down into the darkness, into the heart of the family's legacy. And as he descended into the depths, he knew that he was becoming part of something larger, something ancient and dark. He was becoming part of the hunger, and he knew, with a sick certainty, that there was no escape.